Hi students, it's Miss Crawford here. Today we're going to read President Lyndon Johnson's Voting Rights Act address. And we'll begin on page 6 with a short introductory paragraph that explains what you're going to be reading. All right, here we go. Nearly 100 years after the 15th Amendment to the Constitution gave African Americans the right to vote, they still face discriminatory practices that frequently kept them from exercising this constitutional right. At the height of the civil rights movement in the mid-1960s, President Lyndon Johnson gave a voting rights speech to Congress on March 15, 1965, calling to end the oppression and disenfranchisement of Black voters. Here are some excerpts from the speech. All right, so I'm going to do a little bit of annotating here just to make sure that I understand that introductory paragraph. And up here at the beginning, it said the 15th Amendment made reference to the 15th Amendment, which gave African Americans the right to vote. Okay, so that seems really important to me because we just have been studying the Constitution and amendments and laws evolving over time. However, they still faced discriminatory practices, and I'm going to circle discriminatory practices here that kept them from exercising this right. Okay, and then it goes on to say that this in 1965, President Lyndon Johnson gave a voting rights speech, and that's what we're going to be reading. And in his speech, he's calling for an end to the oppression and disenfranchisement of Black voters. And just so you know, guys, disenfranchisement means keeping someone from voting. So disenfranchisement means you're not able to access your right to vote, or you do not have the right to vote. So Johnson is calling for an end to the oppression and disenfranchisement of Black voters. Okay, let's move on and read the speech. Okay, Johnson begins his speech like this. I speak tonight for the dignity of man and the destiny of democracy. I urge every member of both parties, Americans of all religions and of all colors, from every section of this country, to join me in that cause. At times, history and fate meet at a single time in a single place to shape a turning point in man's unending search for freedom. So it was at Lexington and Concord. So it was a century ago at Appomattox. So it was last week in Selma, Alabama. There is no Negro problem. There is no Southern problem. There is no Northern problem. There is only an American problem. And we are met here tonight as Americans, not as Democrats or Republicans. We are met here as Americans to solve that problem. This was the first nation in the history of the world to be founded with a purpose. The great phrases of that purpose still sound in every American heart, North and South. All men are created equal. Government by consent of the governed. Give me liberty or give me death. All right, let's stop here and go back and do some annotating. So let's start with just kind of underlining things that seem important. Let's go back up to the top. Now he says, I speak tonight. So this is a really big clue from him. He's telling us about what he's talking about. And here he says, he speaks tonight for the dignity of man and the destiny of democracy. Sounds like a very important speech. All right. In paragraph 2, he's basically saying everybody should join me in this cause. Nothing too important there. He's just really trying to get people to be on his side. In paragraph 3, he talks about the history of the United States and how he refers to it as man's unending search for freedom. That seems pretty important. I'm going to underline that. Okay. Now, he gives us some examples of other turning points. So it was at Lexington and Concord. That's the Revolutionary War. So it was at Appomattox. That's a Civil War reference. And so it was last week in Selma, Alabama. Now, Selma is where Martin Luther King and many other civil rights leaders had a march to protest against segregation in the South. Remember, that's where whites and blacks were forced to be separate in public. Now, he says here that there is no Negro problem, no Southern problem, no Northern problem. But what kind of problem is there? This is an American problem. So he's saying this is not just, a problem in part of the country or just for black people or just for white people. Or he's saying this is everybody's problem. This is so bad. It's affecting everybody. Okay. And paragraph 4, again, he's really just saying, hey, I'm here with an idea of how to solve that problem. Okay. Now I'm going to stop here for just a second to just kind of give a summary of what he has said so far. Okay, so what he's said basically is that his speech is going to be about an American problem. And we know from the introduction, although he hasn't really said what he's talking about yet, he said it's a Negro, that it has something to do with Negroes and South and North, but he hasn't really said what he's talking about. But we know from the introduction that he's talking about voting rights being denied to African Americans. Okay. All right. On page 8, we'll continue. He says, those words are a promise to every citizen that he shall share in the dignity of man. This dignity cannot be found in man's possessions. It cannot be found in his power or his position. It really rests on his right to be treated as a man, equal in opportunity to all others. It says that he shall share in freedom. He shall choose his leaders, educate his children, provide for his family according to his ability and his merits as a human being. Okay, so there's some really big words in here. I'm going to try to do some annotating to help myself understand. All right. So he says again, like he did on page 7, the dignity of man. Okay. Now we know from our vocabulary study that dignity really basically means value, having value and respect as a human being. Good, just to give ourselves a reminder of what that means. Okay. He says, dignity cannot be found in man's possessions. It cannot be found in his power or his position. So he's talking about where dignity doesn't come from. Okay. So where does he say it comes from? He says it really comes from his right to be treated as a man, equal in opportunity to all others, meaning all other men. Okay. It says that he shall share in freedom. I'm going to circle that word. That seems really important. He shall choose his leaders, educate his children, provide for his family, according to his ability and his merits as a human being. Okay? All right. Now I want you to think back to that definition of rights. Rights are something you have just because you're a human being. Okay? You don't need to be a special human being. You don't need to be a white human being. You don't need to be a super smart human being. Every human being has rights. All right, good. So let's continue. Many of the issues of civil rights are very complex and most difficult, but about this there can and should be no argument. Every American citizen must have an equal right to vote. There is no reason which can excuse the denial of that right. There is no duty which weighs more heavily on us than the duty we have to ensure that right. Yet the harsh fact is that in many places in this country, men and women are kept from voting simply because they are Negroes. Now, I just want to make sure that you guys understand this word Negroes, okay? I'm going to circle that because It is kind of a strange word. Now, that is a word that is no longer used, but basically it means the same as Black person or African American person. Back in the early part of the 20th century, this was a term that was used all the time to refer to Black people, Negroes. Again, it's not used anymore, but back in the 60s, it was a word that people used all the time. So you know. Now, what is he really saying here? He's saying that, again, this word equal and right to vote kind of stands out to me. So I'm going to go back and underline this. Every American citizen must have an equal right to vote. And there is no reason which can excuse the denial of that right. Okay? People had been denying the right to vote based on somebody's race, even though it was in the Constitution. Many states were denying that right. Okay? But he says that there is no duty, remember, duty means the same as responsibility, which weighs more heavily on us than the duty we have to ensure that right. Okay? Which right? The right to vote. Okay? So he's referring again back to that right to vote. All right? Now, again, I'm going to underline this really important sentence here that says he's just reminding us that even though we do have this right, that men and women are being kept from voting simply because they are Negroes. Okay, so now that we underlined and circled some important things, I'm going to stop and think about what are the main ideas here. Okay, and so I'm going to come back up to where I circled some keywords, and it says that everybody has a right to be treated equal in opportunity to all others. Okay, so I'm really going to put a star by that idea. And then I'm going to come back down here to this one where he says, that's a nice idea, but there's a harsh fact that this really isn't happening. Okay, so I'm going to put a star there as well. Okay, now I'm going to come over here and just kind of do a little summarizing for myself so that I can come back and easily remember what was said here because it's in my own words. Okay, so here he's saying citizens have the right to equal treatment. Because they are humans. Okay. Also, down here, he adds that every citizen has the right to vote. Good. So there's a lot of big, kind of scary words here, and yet I can break it down into two sentences that make sense to me. Citizens have the right to equal treatment because they are humans, and every citizen has the right to vote. Okay, students, at this point, I am going to have you annotate page 9 on your own. I will read it out loud, and please follow along with me, but then do go back and do your own annotations on page 9. I will be looking at those annotations and checking on how you are coming along. All right. Starting on paragraph 9, he says, experience has clearly shown that the existing process of law cannot overcome systematic and ingenious discrimination. No law that we now have on the books, and I have helped to put 3 of them there, can ensure the right to vote when local officials are determined to deny it. In such a case, our duty must be clear to all of us. The Constitution says that no person shall be kept from voting because of his race or his color. We have all sworn an oath before God to support and to defend that Constitution. We must now act in obedience to that oath. Okay, go back and add your own underlines, stars, and summaries. Good luck.